Hello, and welcome to Writers Group Therapy.
I'm Tom.
And I'm Roshni. We're writers helping writers with whatever writing ailments you might have.
Whether it's related to your craft or your career, we can help.
Are you ready for your session?
The
The doctors
doctors
are
are
in.
in. In this session of Writers Group Therapy, we discuss Netflix's visually stunning and narratively compelling Our Living World with award-winning producer and showrunner Ben Roy. Ben has worked across many genres and platforms, creating content for Channel 4, the BBC, PBS, and Animal Planet. He has produced adventure and wildlife shows for Discovery, National Geographic, and the Smithsonian channels. Welcome to the show, Ben.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for being with us. You're in the UK, correct?
Yeah, I'm in Bristol, in the UK.
Bristol. So that's why we're recording early, so you're recording late. We appreciate you coming on the show. This is a beautiful show you've put together, Our Living World on Netflix. I've watched most of it, and it's just really captivating. It's narrated by Kate Blanchett, who just makes everything seem so soothing and peaceful, even when they're being devoured by other animals.
Yep.
When you look at something like this, and we've seen a lot of these over the years, they just keep getting more and more visually stunning. The question always is, how do you conceive of a show like Our Living World? How do you pitch it? How do you, derive the story and then go out and produce it?
It's a big question.
Yes.
I so I'll break it up if that's all right. I think in terms of conceiving of the idea was born from a realization, I suppose, over the producers working on the show and kind of the people kind of developing and coming up with the ideas, who are all active wildlife filmmakers who spend a lot of time in different places around the world watching animals behave and trying to film animal behavior and trying to film natural phenomena and so on and so forth. And realizing that actually there's great depth of research and scientific knowledge required to reveal all these intricacies, all these kind of very intimate moments in animals' lives, or what exactly is going on with specific ecosystems in specific parts of the world. But there's no scientific field of kind of whole worldology, if you see what I mean. The idea that actually all of these specializations only really make sense when they're kind of put together and you realize that, oh, these things are connected. And so I think there was a realization that increasing specialization of scientific research does, that reveals these amazing, wonderful things, but it can sometimes obscure the bigger picture. So what we were trying to...
I'm sorry. And the story, it goes across the 4 episodes. It really tells one story. It's you start with Nature's Amazing Network, The Rhythm of Life, The Breaking Point, and then The Road to Recovery. So it has its own natural arc of a story too.
Absolutely. And I think if you start with the very simple idea that no species on Earth can exist in isolation by itself, that's a really simple idea that quite quickly kind of balloons almost out of control. That you realize, oh, well, if that particular animal needs other animals, and those animals need the plants, and those plants need the other animals, that, quite quickly you've connected the whole world together into this, symbiotic network where everything that individual plants and animals do is amplified through the network and is connected to everything else on Earth. So I think that's where the concept came from. And then in terms of how do you pitch that show, you can't really pitch a concept like that. So what you have to do is, what we, our currency is cool animal behavior, is cool animals doing cool things in cool places. So that, kind of the skill in pitching this show was that this is a really big, high concept idea, but we're going to try and tell it in these accessible, bite-sized ways with animal stories. Animals at key moments in their lives, kind of cool interactions between animals hunting each other, animals cooperating together in ways that have these far-reaching knock-on effects.
Let's take it back a little bit. I'd be curious to know how you got started and why documentaries and not narrative. You know what I mean? Like, it's a very different skill set. So how come you went on that path versus like, oh, I want to make a fiction movie about animals or something? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. Well, I think because it's real, and that, for me, the idea that we are that the currency that we're dealing with is this is stuff that's out there and is happening out there, and we can observe it. Scientists go out there and observe it, and we're learning we're learning new stuff about how our planet works all the time. And that is there are revelations in there, and there are surprises in there, and there are there are things in there that are, it's a cliche, but are stranger than fiction. And that gives, as raw material for storytelling, that's really potent. And so for me, working with factual storytelling has always been the stuff that I find easiest to get hold of and actually most revelational.
So you mentioned the surprising nature of nature.
Yeah.
Obviously, the animals don't line up for your shots and your takes, and you can't do shot lists. You can't schedule the animals. They have their own cycles and what have you, as you mentioned
Yeah.
in the show.
Yeah.
How long does it take to collect all this footage and to get even just to get some of these shots, which were just amazing? With the technology, that's a whole other question I want to ask. But
Yeah.
how long does it take to actually go out and get all this footage to then come back and start to figure out where the story is?
Yeah, sure. Well, actually, we try and do in this particular, rewind a bit. Traditional wildlife filmmaking has been exactly that, has been sending small crews with the right kit off to remote parts of the world where they would sit for days and days and weeks and months and wait for specific bits of behavior to happen that they're lucky enough to capture. They then bring it home and try and tell a story with the material that they've acquired. The way that we did some of that in this show, there are sequences of lions hunting wildebeest in the
Hmm.
in Botswana, where yes, that's filmmakers sitting and waiting for stuff to happen, and that we're talking weeks there, we're talking months potentially. And other sequences like our muskox who are rutting in the on the tundra, the Arctic tundra. Again, that's get in the right place, sit and wait for stuff to happen. But a lot of these stories, it wasn't so much the revelation for us wasn't so much the behavior that was happening. We knew that we know that elephants knock down trees in the dry season in the Kalahari to reach the leaves. We knew that happened. We knew that would actually be quite easy to capture. But the revelation for us was what the knock-on effect of that, what that means for the ecosystem, what that means for the bigger picture. And it means that these elephants are engineering this landscape, preparing it for bushfires, essentially. So that's almost in reverse, that we knew the story that we wanted to tell, and we knew that it was illustrative because it had this big wow moment where we realized that only thanks to the elephants doing what they do in Africa, do these amazing nutrients come up out of the African soil, out of the African plants, and so on and so forth in forest fires, and then get blown across the Atlantic to rain down in Brazil. So in that sense, a lot of the time was spent nailing down the stories and working out what were the connections that we wanted to illustrate before then going out to capture them. That said, the filming period was we shot this series over 2 years, probably. Some of the sequences, as I said, sitting in the field waiting for stuff to happen. Some of the sequences much more controlled. And I'm going to give you an example of we tell a story in episode 4 about gopher tortoises in Florida, in the pine forest in Florida,
Yeah.
who are keystone species because they help these forests recover from forest fires, from the fires that tear through these forests on a regular basis. We didn't want to try and put a crew in the middle of a forest fire. We didn't want to try and put a tortoise in the middle of a forest fire because health and safety considerations, all that sort of stuff. So that was we storyboarded that sequence. We knew what the science was. We knew what the ecological story was that we wanted to tell, and we essentially went out and did a dramatic reconstruction. So this speaks a little bit to Ashley's question about fact versus fiction. We're dealing with scientific facts in this storytelling, but we're using all the filmmakers' tools at our disposal to tell. So we're using dramatic reconstruction, and we're using visual effects, as you'll have seen in the show, and we're using, you know, kind of fun soundtracks and sound effects and all this stuff, that we're using all these tools to tell these true stories.
That's so cool. 2 years. Oh my goodness, that's a lot of patience. It's interesting because so Tom and I both come from journalism backgrounds. I'm print,
Yeah.
and I think, Tom, you were also print, right?
Yes, I was also in print.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's interesting because I think we come from this old school journalism idea of, like, you kind of know what the story is, but in a way you let the story unfold, and it's interesting because you mentioned you and your team went in kind of knowing the overall story, even if you didn't have, like,
Mhm.
the micro stories, you knew the
Yeah.
overall thing of what you wanted
Yeah.
to do.
Yeah.
And how does that change because you're interacting with the environment in a certain way to get a certain angle, like, how does that change you know what I'm saying? Like, kind of like, what you're going after, you know what I mean? Because you're sort of manipulating it without trying to manipulate it.
Yeah, I mean, you know what I mean. Our forest elephants in Gabon is a really good example of this. The reason that we went to film forest elephants in Gabon was because we found this fantastic piece of research, scientific research, had been done that said that forests with forest elephants in them capture more carbon than forests without forest elephants in them. And that's that's kind of a big that's a big revelation. So we're like, okay, so how can we tell this story in a way that doesn't feel like a scientific paper? How can we tell this story in a way that feels like there's a heart to it, and there's a a hero who we can follow? And we didn't know the answer to that. What we knew was there are forest elephants in this part of the forest. We knew that there were researchers who'd been studying them for quite a long period of time, so they were quite habituated to being around, or to having people being near them, being around them. We knew the places where they were likely to go and dig for salt or go and drink, and we knew where the fruiting trees were. So then we sent a team out there. They put platforms up on the up in the trees in the places where the researchers told us, oh, the elephants come through here. Oh, they come out here in the evenings and they browse in browse on the edges of the forest, or they come and they graze on the grasslands in this open area. And so we knew the story that we wanted to tell. We knew where the cast were. It is then following what they're actually doing and trying to spot, oh, look, there's a baby who's very characterful and very cute and is doing kind of cute stuff. And she's following her grandma around and doesn't let her grandma out of her sight. So then we're building up a narrative, depending on the behavior that we're seeing, that helps us. Because actually everything that they do as they're walking around helps this forest what's the word? Kind of helps garden the forest. Basically, it helps the larger, slower growing trees grow, and it weeds out the kind of smaller, choking undergrowth. Essentially, so as long as we could capture those moments within the story that we were telling, we had our take home, our reveal. We had the material there to do our reveal, that only thanks to these elephants is this forest so effective. And then actually what unfolded was just a really lovely, heartwarming story about a matriarch elephant who's the kind of the grandmother who leads the herd, just on her kind of daily rounds of the forest and taking her youngest granddaughter with her. Does that
Aw.
answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, that's so cute, and it's stuff that, like, I don't think the average person would have thought, which means you probably did a ton of research before you even stepped foot in the field,
Yeah,
I'm guessing.
yeah.
How much research, how much time was spent in research before you ever went out?
Uh, I think there was probably a year's worth of development of the show, and then a year's worth of pre-production, which was trying to find these stories, we had a team of 4 dedicated researchers who, one of them's a PhD in geology, one of them's a botanist, one of them's a expert on kind of underwater animal behavior. And so we had this kind of research team who were then casting our net out far and wide, looking for these animal stories that did the 2 things that I've mentioned. One, that gave us really cool animals in cool places doing cool things, but number 2, had these knock-on effects, had these connections that we could help use to reveal this network that kind of connects everything around the world. So our wow moments were as much in what the animals doing their stuff means as much in that as they were in what the animal's actually doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I feel like the tagline for the show should be "Cool animals in cool places doing cool things." They'd be
Yeah,
like, "What kind of
yeah.
show is this?" But yeah, that'd be so funny. I feel like that was your pitch for the whole thing.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously you're focusing on the animals, but what about behind the scenes with the people? Were there any political issues or, cultural issues or things like that that you dealt with just to try to get these images?
Yeah, I think that, there's always we're not framing out humanity in this series. We're talking about a network in which people are as integral part of it as the animals that we're looking at. So I mean, particularly when we get into episode 4 and we're talking about the fruit bats who've migrated into the city of Sydney and are now living in Sydney, or we're talking about the salmon on the northwest Pacific coast who have to swim across roads to get to their spawning grounds. We're filming in and amongst people, and that's what is that's what's going on the whole time. Bats was really interesting because they play this really important ecological role in the in the forest ecosystems in Australia. But where they've been displaced, no one really wants fruit bats hanging out in the trees at the bottom of their garden because they're noisy and they're messy and they're dirty. There is inherent kind of conflict going on there. But the story that we chose to tell about them is actually about their ecological role and the importance that they play within that ecosystem. So, you can't film wildlife today without acknowledging the fact that the human and the animal world are very much overlapping, interwoven.
Well, I actually like to think that actually there is no real human world. We live in the animal world, basically.
Yeah. You're right. It's the same world.
I see posts online of people complaining about certain animals in their yards or in their woods behind their house. I'm like, you know what?
Yeah.
You're the one who moved out there.
Yeah. It's true.
So this is interesting. So this is a unique production process that I'm seeing here. So you do all your research, you kind of plan out what based on the research you find about the animals and their relationship to the world. You have a educated hypothesis on how you're going to go out and get these visuals. So it's not just I'm going to go look at a certain animal and see what they do. So you did that. You spent a couple of years getting it ready and going out and doing that. And then you come back and now you've got a fairly decent story structure going. And then you find there's a few places where you need to insert some stuff because you can't film the underground stuff or the underwater stuff as you like to. So I noticed the show uses VFX and computer graphics to illustrate some of those concepts, but you do it really judiciously. Like you were really trying not to break the realism with VFX until you really had to explain a certain point.
Yeah, I think we made a really clear. I'm glad that you clocked the effort. Thanks, Tom. We made a really clear decision early on that we wanted to use our visual effects to enhance the natural world, not to replace the natural world. And we only wanted to use them where we were talking about processes or things that we can't actually see. But processes that are out there and happening, or invisible stuff in the world that is doing a job. So we use our VFX when we're going underground and we're talking about mycelial fungal networks, and we're talking about how they transfer nutrients or how they transfer communication, if that's the right word for what they're doing. And we use VFX to illustrate what's happening in nutrient-rich fires, or in thunderclouds when the lightning strikes are fixing nitrogen in the air into soluble nitrates in the rain. But we're using these VFX on natural plates. So these are, this is footage that we have shot in a particular way in the wild. So for our mycelial networks in the various forests, we go to the forests and we shoot. We move the cameras through the forest in particular ways, imagining what this is then going to look like when we add our animation, kind of in the shadows or underneath the ground or whatever it might be. So we're always trying to follow something and film something rather than just saying, okay, we'll cut to black here and we'll build a CG world to reveal what we want to say. So it had to feel organic. I think was kind of our number one rule there. But then also the second rule, the thing that that hopefully you will have, will be helping your appreciation of those scenes, is that invisible stuff doesn't sound like anything. So we've also then given all our VFX a particular a soundtrack, the sound effects of what does a mycelium sound like, and obviously we don't know what it sounds like, but we're giving it we're giving it an emotive sense through, it's a sense of, it's whispering and it's slightly electronic, but it's organic. So we've built these audio worlds around some of this stuff so that we can feel the magic of what's going on.
Yeah, and it's you really feel like you're in the moment when you're watching this, because you get really up close with a lot of these subjects. And so I was wondering, from a technical standpoint, are you using high resolution, real long lenses and that kind of thing to get a lot of these shots, or what's your technical toolkit look like?
Yeah, again, it's different for each sequence, because each of these animal sequences or plant sequences, whatever they might be, you can imagine them as their own individual, separate little films, little little worlds that we're filming, and they each require a different technical approach. We work with technicians, camera operators, camera assistants, grip technicians who spend their lives devising the best way to capture this stuff. So in some sequences, yes, we're using the kind of super long lenses and we're standing a long way away from where the action is happening. In other situations, we're using kind of super macro stuff, or we're using very, very low light capable cameras where the technicians have worked out particular ways of capturing what's going on.
Like for the salamanders at night when they were glowing, that kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's and we'll be using kind of dark lighting in that situation as well, and using different kind of capture techniques, if you like. But the key thing is, for a lot of these places, this stuff has to be small and portable, and you have to be able to pack it all up and literally carry it. The muskox sequence, where those enormous muskox are rutting, are banging their heads together. That was filmed in a national park in Norway where there are no vehicles allowed, which is great because you can't disturb the wildlife. But that makes it tough when you have to literally carry your 240-kilo packs in for 12 miles just to find the animals before you then put your sticks up and sit and wait for them to start doing what you hope they're going to do. So it's a lot of people. Obviously there's a lot of very kind of cutting edge camera tech involved, but there's also just a lot of very human grunt work. So it's a real combination of those two things.
Yeah, and you have also had a lot of like time lapse work you did especially with the plants, and I love the story about the crabs. That was really cool.
Yes,
I was wondering about the crabs. I wasn't sure if I could tell if the crabs' articulation was sped up or if they really move like that. They kind of wave their claws to attract a mate, kind of thing.
That is how fast they move. Yeah,
really.
That's what they're doing. Yeah, they have that kind of funny jerk at the start, and then. But the thing about the crabs, they're tiny. They are the size of a thumbnail.
Really? Wow.
And so when you think about that, and you think about the ground that they're on is salty, and squidgy and, knee deep, and the temperature is very, very hot, and the tide comes in and goes out, and you've only got a few hours to then think about the crew who have to go out there and put their tripods in this, corrosive, salty nastiness, and then manage to get those beautiful, smooth, level shots down at the crab's claw level. That was a real technical challenge just to deliver those things, and then get home and hose down all your kit at the end of each day so it doesn't all rust up before the next morning.
Yeah. Well, I love the show. I think it's fantastic. All I can ask is, what do you have on the plan next? What's your next 2 years going to be like?
Well, I'm in the middle of my next 2 years now. So we have made our living world. The follow up that I'm currently working on is called Our Water World, and this is another Netflix show made out of Wildspace Productions in the UK. And this is looking at the freshwater world and all the cool animals doing cool stuff in cool places that you might find in that world.
Love that.
I can't say much more about it, but
you can't tell us where you're going.
We're looking at a whole new world. Approaching the same world, but in a whole new way is, I suppose, how I would describe our approach for this show.
All right. Cool. Well, stay safe out there while you're out in the jungle and the oceans and things.
Thanks.
I do like to ask, so what didn't make it into the show? Was there something you wanted to get that you didn't get?
What did we want to get that we didn't get? There was a story that I wanted to do about whales, about how whales, all of our stories are about how the creatures that we're featuring have these amazing knock-on effects in the habitats in which they live and beyond. And whales have an enormous effect on the oceans that they swim through for lots and lots of reasons. I think we briefly talked on the fact that whale poop is incredibly fertile and helps plankton blooms. But they also just in their diving and diving to the deeps and rising back up to the surface to breathe, that process of diving and rising helps stir the oceans in a way that increases its productivity and the ocean's fertility. And then if you also think about over the lifespan of a whale, the amount of nutrients, the amount of matter that it's accumulated in its body. When a whale then dies, it's also, there's this huge kind of transfer of chemistry and biochemistry that a whale delivers throughout its life, throughout its feeding and its travels and its, and its ocean crossing migrations, even after its death. That these are that the whales are the great kind of stirrers of the ocean. And that was the story that we've touched on bits of, but there's a whole lot more to tell.
Maybe it's going to be in the ocean series, the water series. Well, this has all been really fascinating. We'd love to have you back to talk more when you have another show coming out. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Nice to speak to you, Tom, Rashni.
Yeah, so do check out Our Living World on Netflix now. And follow us online at WG Therapy on Instagram and Twitter, and writersgrouptherapy.com, where you can find all our other episodes. And we will see you next time. Thanks for listening.